So just to start out, um, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit and just let you know I am a local mom who struggled through this pandemic. And I am also a scientist who loves a lot of people who have had questions about this COVID-19 vaccine. And so I figured I could help because I've taught people who are now doctors these concepts about viruses, about RNA and DNA. And so I figured I could help people get answers to their questions. I don't work for the government or any pharmaceutical company. And so I have no vested interest in your personal decisions. I just want to help people. So it's easiest to think about how coronavirus works by thinking about it as an army. And its goal is to take over our bodies to make more of itself. And our immune system is our defensive army. Its goal is to detect and destroy a virus and protect us from that. So different viruses have different coats. Here I have the coronavirus compared to a polio virus and an influenza virus. And if our immune system hasn't seen this coat, it has no defense against it. A virus can't make more of itself alone. It can only make more of itself when it infects a cell. It hijacks our body to produce more of itself by inserting its own genetic material and then producing more of itself. So once it's in our cells, it builds its army. And then those cells release more virus that can infect more cells of ourselves, and also infected people produce and breathe out the virus before they even feel symptoms. So even if this person here has never really experienced much of a symptom at all, or maybe it was just a mild cold, the person is producing the virus that might cause severe disease in someone who is more susceptible, like an older individual who has a weakened immune system. Pregnant women also have weakened immune systems, and people who are undergoing chemotherapy, like this little friend of, this is my daughter's friend or my friend's daughter, who is 4 years old, can't get a vaccine and is undergoing chemotherapy, which also weakens the immune system. So these people would be more susceptible to getting serious disease. So it's so important to prevent infection because it saves lives. It saves the lives of people who may not have a strong immune system to protect them. So our virus can use our bodies to mutate to make a stronger, more infectious or deadlier variant. And that new variant could also cause severe illness in new populations like younger people. So preventing infection prevents new variants from arising. And coronavirus can shut down whole organs if it isn't stopped. So for the lungs, that would mean they couldn't clear fluid or breathe properly, and that's called pneumonia. Coronavirus infections produce blood clots in 16.5% of infections, even including those who have asymptomatic or mild cases of coronavirus infection. It can damage the heart to cause failure, the lungs and the kidneys cause failure of these organs, and it can damage the brain by causing strokes. But many of us are not at risk for severe illness. So for mild and moderate COVID-19 cases, these include shortness of breath, cough or sore throat, a loss of taste and smell that can last for months, fever, headache, fatigue that can also last for months, mini strokes, which people describe as brain fog, hair loss that occurs 2 to 5 months after infection. This has happened to several of my friends who have had COVID-19. They didn't really have severe disease, but they lost their hair around 2 to 5 months after the infection. Depression, heart palpitations, and COVID toes that look like this are also associated with mild or moderate COVID-19 cases. So even if we're not at risk for severe disease, none of these things sound very fun, and I would rather prevent them. So once our immune system detects an infection, it will fight back. Our immune system will raise our temperature a little bit to slow down the virus. We'll feel tired and sore as our body builds up a defense against the virus. And these are actually good signs that our immune system is working well. So what's helped this coronavirus army win? How come it's killed so many people? Why has everyone been so susceptible to it? Or not everyone, but a lot of people. The main reason is that it had a coat or a uniform that isn't recognized by most of us. And there were high numbers invading, and that's because there were so many people infected and it's being breathed out into the air. And it also does really well in weaker immune systems. So we've been outnumbered. So this can feel a little bit intimidating. At the same time, we as a world have gone through pandemics before. Viruses have closed down the world before. Thinking about polio, polio was a crippling disease in the 1950s, and this is a polio ward in 1950 with these iron lungs that are helping people breathe. And so we can learn from history. What did we do then? What would help our immune system is a vaccine. A vaccine is a warning sign to your immune system to kill the virus before it takes over your cells. So for polio, this was actually a crippled virus, the virus itself that was crippled and couldn't hurt you to the same degree that the real virus could. So it'd be like bringing an enemy from during a war, bringing a dead enemy over and saying, this is the uniform of the enemy. So anyone like this is our enemy, and we need to, that's our target, basically. And later vaccines were developed that were just part of the enemy uniform, like bringing the helmet of the other side and saying, this anyone wearing this hat is dangerous, destroy them before they destroy us. And those vaccines work. So here is a graph, and the size of these blue circles is showing the number of infections in the United States in a given year. So here we have polio that got to be pretty bad, and then this orange circle is when the vaccine was developed and distributed. Now, enough people took that vaccine that we completely eradicated polio in the United States. And the same was true for many of these other diseases. But you'll notice that it took a decade to make that polio vaccine. And the other issue is a virus can't survive. It can't make more of itself alone. It needs to infect cells, right? So these, the virus or that coat decoration had to be produced in cells, and it was produced in chicken eggs. Well, 2% of children are allergic to chicken eggs. So those allergic reactions would make it so it was difficult to take a vaccine, so it couldn't help those particular kids. And also those allergic reactions scare people. So mRNA to the rescue. Scientists have been working for the last 30 years to develop vaccines using mRNA. So what is mRNA? mRNA is a messenger in our body's natural language. RNA is degradable instructions that our body is full of. We send messages around to different, to make things, decorations for our own cells, for example, using mRNA. It's the language that we use. Our cells then will read that instruction manual and produce a part of the coat or uniform as a warning sign of what this virus looks like. So it'd be like one of those flimsy little paper instructions for making a coat that I don't know if anyone else has used, but I did when I was younger. So RNA, these mRNA vaccines, the idea was that they could be developed fast after we read the instructions of a virus infection. Then they can be made fast In my lab, it takes about an hour to make mRNA, whereas it would take several days to make the coat decoration itself. And then mRNA can be adapted fast when new variants arise. And there's less potential for allergic reactions because there are less ingredients. So I have a question here for those of you who are there, and you can answer in the chat or unmute yourself for a second if you would like. Well, maybe in the chat would be best. So what would it take for us to feel comfortable taking a new vaccine? What would it take? For me, I wanted to know what the ingredients were, and I wanted to know that it was safe in animals. And I read quite a bit about how it worked. So how about for some of you, what are some of the answers we hear? Do you see any in the chat, Kat?
Yes, we've got safety and research. And for myself, knowing that other people have taken it and haven't had adverse reactions.
Right, yeah. And those are kind of the same thing, right? We want to know it's safe, and we want to know that there's been a lot of research done. And for each of us, it's going to be different what amount of information or what information we need to know before we feel comfortable with something like this. And that's normal. So, so yes, this is a great idea to make a vaccine that can be developed fast and made fast and adapted fast. And we can still really want to know a lot about it. So one of the things that a lot of people want to know is this technology new? So scientists have been working on developing mRNA vaccines since the 1990s. And that's about when I started, that is when I started working in science and started working with mRNA myself. And mRNA vaccines against cancer, the flu, HIV, Zika, rabies, all started clinical trials well before 2017. And and so we have information about how those mRNA vaccines have done and that they were safe in these people that have taken them. However, those clinical trials are all still ongoing because we're not in a pandemic of any of these diseases right now. So it takes longer to conduct those, enroll people and conduct those trials. A lot of people feel a little bit worried maybe about how the vaccines were developed so fast. And one of the reasons that they were able to be developed so fast is because funding was available. The whole world, every country that had money to throw at this problem did. And we've had a lot of science research that's been done over the past 3 decades that actually we all pay for. Taxpayers fund basic science research for exactly this problem. So because of that, we can read genes fast, those instructions for how to make anything in our body. We know what the code is for one of those decorations on the coat. We know a lot more about RNA and how it gets into cells. And so the vaccine methods had already been developed before the pandemic hit. They were just applied to a new problem. And then the other reason that I think is just beautiful is that scientists from all over the world were working together on this and sharing information with each other to help solve the problem. So like I said, for me, one of the things that I wanted to know before I felt comfortable taking this vaccine is what was in it. And those, the language that's used for the ingredients is kind of like a different language. It's science language, and things are in this chemical language. So the 4 main ingredients, all of the ingredients can be divided into 4 categories. One is a fat droplet, and that helps the RNA get into cells and protects it. So fats are things like olive oil, and even olive oil, if you broke it down to its chemical name, it would sound intimidating, but it's just fat. And then mRNA, and that's the pattern to make part of that enemy uniform to show us what the enemy is wearing. And then some salts and some sugar. So sugar, just table sugar, is called sucrose and in science language. So it's kind of like a cookie with less fat and less sugar. It's good for you. The other thing that's important is that vaccines, important to some people, is that vaccines are vegan. These mRNA vaccines are vegan. They don't use any cells to produce them. They're just produced in just a little tube, mixing those ingredients together. So this is how it works. Our cells will make part of that enemy uniform. So here we've got that little fat droplet that's dropping in the mRNA that I've represented as this little orange squiggle. Our cells will read that orange squiggle, that mRNA, and make part of that enemy uniform. It's called the spike protein, but it's like a decoration on the coat of the virus. Then the mRNA is going to degrade really quickly. So we are not even going to have the vaccine components in our body very long at all. Like hours later, it'll be completely recycled in our body. It's also important to note that mRNA is not DNA, which is what our genes are made out of. And this vaccine RNA cannot go near our DNA. It doesn't go near it. Our DNA, our genes, are housed in what's called the nucleus, and they're packaged really tightly and protected against harm. And so this RNA is not going to go near our genes. So then these little coat decorations are going to be displayed on the outside of our cells. Our body will produce what's called antibodies that'll recognize that coat decoration specifically. It's like showing a warning sign. Anyone wearing this hat or this little spike protein is dangerous, destroy it. And then our immune response is amazing. It's going to produce antibodies to neutralize the virus. What that means is that they'll cover the virus so that if we come in contact with the virus, it'll just bounce off our cells. It will, if the virus can't get into our cells, it can't replicate, it can't make more of itself, it can't turn your cells against you. Then the antibodies will present the virus to cells and enzymes to teach immune cells to destroy the virus. So I represented these immune cells called dendritic cells as a Pac-Man because I'm a child of the 80s. They just go around and munch anything covered with antibodies. And then the vaccine will teach immune cells to kill infected cells that are working for the enemy. And this is important because we don't want those traitor cells to be producing more and more virus. So these vaccines are different from other medications like Tylenol or ibuprofen that will distribute throughout our body and stay in our system for several hours and treat the symptoms. Like it'll bring down the fever and the soreness, make you feel better, but the virus is continuing to hurt you and damage your cells. Vaccines, on the other hand, are teaching your immune system, and then your immune system is actually killing the virus, preventing it from infecting cells and preventing it from hurting you further. It's also broken down a lot faster, so the vaccine isn't even around very long in your body. So someone answered that they would want to know if it's safe, if these vaccines are safe. They'd want to know that research was done. So research has been published in several scientific journals and also made publicly available on these mRNA vaccines, that they were tested in monkeys and also in mice. And in those tests, they showed that the vaccines were safe for the monkeys and the mice, and also that they produced antibodies. Both the monkeys and the mice produced a big antibody response to these vaccines. So you can't really ask a monkey or a mouse, like, how are you feeling? But you can tell that they're making what they need to protect themselves against the virus if they're making those antibodies. So those were the first tests that were published and are available publicly. And then clinical trials also are really important. Now, these are the trials. Kat had said that she really would want to know that it had been tried in humans and that it was safe in humans. So that's also what all scientists want to know. And so for that reason, there are clinical trials. The first clinical trial is really done in just between 100 and 500 people, and it's just to determine whether it's safe and produces antibodies in that small group of people. So they're not measuring symptoms at that point. Then in phase 2 and phase 3, they're looking for safety and efficacy. So does it bring down the symptoms of COVID-19? In first a smaller group and then a larger group. The larger group is important to include different medical histories, different races, different age groups. And so all of those are included in the phase 3 clinical trials. So getting into the details of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials, there were 43,448 volunteers in the clinical trials, 16 years old and older. 45% of these were between the ages of 56 and 85 years old, and 30% were racially diverse. They were divided into 2 different groups. One group would receive a saltwater shot. So basically it had no vaccine in it, and they wouldn't know that. And then the other half would get the vaccine. Then they would report back how they felt, any symptoms that they had, and get tested for COVID-19 if they had COVID-19 symptoms. Remember, they didn't know which group they were in, so their exposure to COVID-19, to coronavirus, is going to be similar. Now, for those people that got the saltwater shot, they just got the placebo, no vaccine at all. There were 162 cases of COVID-19 and 9 cases that were severe enough to require hospitalization. And then among those people who had the vaccine, there were only 7 mild cases of COVID-19 and 1 severe case. So even though these 2 groups were exposed to the same conditions, there were less people who got COVID-19 in the group that got the vaccine, and the cases were more mild. So now clinical trials have been done by Pfizer for a younger population between the ages of 12 and 15. And this group was 2,260, and they were divided into 2 groups. There were 18 cases of COVID-19 in the placebo group, the group that did not get the vaccine, and 0 cases in the group that got the vaccine. They also tested antibody levels in these clinical trials volunteers, and the antibody response was even better than it had been in the other ages that had been tested. So this vaccine is just wonderfully safe and effective for children between the ages of 12 and 15. So for the Moderna vaccines, there were 30,000 participants. And again, it was divided, this group included 11,000 people of color, 5,000 people with risk factors, and then 7,000 people over the age of 65, which is another risk factor for COVID-19. And again, the group that got no vaccine, so just a placebo shot, there were 196 cases of COVID-19, and 30 cases that were very severe, and 1 case resulted in death. Whereas of those people who got the vaccine, there were only 11 mild COVID-19 cases. So for for all of this data, you might be wondering, well, if that's what the pharmaceutical company is reporting, how do I know if I can trust that? Because they obviously have a monetary, they're vested in the results. Well, the reason that I trust the clinical trials data is that it's collected by not the pharmaceutical company, but actually by doctors and nurses in over 100 different hospitals in many different locations. So those doctors and nurses don't have any vested interest in the results of the clinical trials. And then the patients or the volunteers are blinded. They don't know which group they're in. So they're going to just report what they feel. Then it also helps me to trust the data, to know that it's been reviewed by 5 different agencies that also don't get any monetary gain from the results of clinical trials. They just want to make sure we're safe and protected against COVID-19. So these 5 different agencies are a safety monitoring board, there's independent scientists, career scientists at the Food and Drug Administration. There's an advisory committee on immunization practices, and then the Center for Disease Control, a panel in the Center for Disease Control. So none of these people have any vested interest in the results of the trials, and then they get reported. But even if you feel a little bit iffy about these data, scientists, since this has all been published, once it was released to the public, these vaccines were released to the public and administered to hospitals, 3 different hospitals conducted their own trials that they did a little bit differently. And for these, instead of looking for symptoms, they tested people using the test. I don't know if anyone else has had the COVID-19 test with, they go up your nose. It's not very comfortable. At least I did not enjoy it. So they did that same test for people regardless of their vaccine status. So some people had decided not to get the vaccine yet. They wanted to wait a little longer. And that's this group right here. And then some people got doses of the vaccine. So this is 1 dose or 2 doses. And then they tested infection every week after the along the trial that they were doing, the experiment that they were doing. And what they found is that there was a higher percentage of people who got COVID-19 infections in those people who did not have the vaccine than those who got 1 dose. And if you had 2 doses of vaccine, in other words, you were fully vaccinated, there was almost no one who got any COVID-19 vaccine or any COVID-19 infection. And like the risk is almost nothing. And this includes people who have risk factors or compromised immune systems. And everyone in this whole group wore masks because it was required at these hospitals. Now, similar results were published from 2 other universities. So university hospitals. Another way to look at this data is to just look at the number of infections in the hospital over time. So down here on this graph, this is showing the number of infections that were happening, all these dots on different days. And in the world, in the country at large, in the community, this would have continued to go up. This is the trend of the rest of the community. But when the vaccination effort started here in this red line, the infection numbers in the hospital started going down. And when 70% of those employees were vaccinated, those infection numbers went down to almost 0. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines protect 95% of people from even mild COVID-19 symptoms and protect almost everyone from severe COVID-19 and COVID-19 related death. But you might be wondering, so if I've already had COVID-19, should I get the vaccine? How would my immunity compare if I had a natural infection to whether I got a vaccine? And this graph is what answered that for me. These little green dots represent the amount of antibodies in the blood of someone who was not aware of having a COVID-19 infection. So remember, antibodies are what cover the virus and make it so it can't infect our cells. And you'll see there's a pretty big range. So these people up here probably had an infection that they weren't aware of. It was asymptomatic. Now this in purple here, these are the people who did have a COVID-19 infection, that they tested positive for COVID-19. And you can see that there's quite a big range of the number of infection, or the number of antibodies in their blood. Now, after 1 dose of vaccine, everyone has more antibodies in their blood, even including those people who had previously had an infection. And then here you can see that both populations, so the people who never were infected and those that were infected, are very well protected because they have a very high level of antibodies in their blood that's going to protect them. So now the Johnson & Johnson vaccines and the AstraZeneca vaccines are also a warning sign showing the decoration on the virus coat, but they're made and delivered to cells differently than mRNA vaccines. They're made in a more traditional manner and kind of more like the flu vaccine is made. And they were also tested. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was tested in 43,783 people in clinical trials, including 34% over the age of 60 and 35% of racially diverse backgrounds in the United States. And then these vaccines also protect everyone from severe COVID-19 and COVID-19 related death. And we don't yet know the protection against infection. The same test that was done in those hospitals for this vaccine have not been done, to my knowledge. So a lot of people have questions about the side effects. So the side effects really are very related to just our immune response working. So when our immune system detects something different, we can sometimes feel tired as our body builds up that antibody army to defend us. And so tiredness, soreness, a mild fever, all are normal side effects. If you don't have those side effects, you don't need to be concerned. It's kind of like morning sicknesses for a pregnant person. Like, it does tell you that you're pregnant, but the lack of morning sickness does not tell you that you're not pregnant. Yeah, so many people have very healthy pregnancies without getting morning sickness. Allergic reactions still have occurred with these mRNA vaccines, even though they were designed to prevent allergic reactions, but they're a lot more rare than they are for other vaccines and even for other things like eggs. So it's between 3 and 5 cases of an allergic reaction out of every million vaccinations. So a lot of people kind of wonder if they're not at risk for severe disease, why should I get vaccinated? And this is a demonstration that was made by Richard Harris from NPR, and he kindly let me use it for education and outreach. So these squares represent a community. You can imagine it being like everyone who goes to the grocery store that you go to. And it's the same community in these three situations where 5% are vaccinated, 30% are vaccinated, and 75% are vaccinated. Now, I've pointed out the same individuals in each of these squares that may be immunocompromised for different reasons or susceptible to the virus for different reasons. And then the pink represents infected individuals, the same infected individuals in each of these squares. And then the light gray are unvaccinated people, and the darker gray are vaccinated people. Now, if you run this simulation, you'll see that if only 5% are vaccinated, almost everyone gets infected, including some of those who are vaccinated but have weaker immune systems. And so a lot of severe disease is caused by this. Where in 30% vaccinated population, you can see that you do decrease the number of infections, but it doesn't protect those people who are really at risk because of having compromised immune systems. So even some of those who are vaccinated are going to be infected because their own immune system can't defend them. When 75% of people are vaccinated in this community, that outbreak just doesn't happen. Very few people get infected, and this is what protects those people who have compromised immune systems or can't get vaccinated yet. So how can we help our community? Without the vaccine, if we're not protected by that vaccine, the virus can use us. It can use our body to hurt us and to hurt people that we love. And it's the virus doing the damage, right? It's the virus that is hurting us. But when we take the vaccine, we make weapons that are specifically designed to dismantle the threat. They dismantle the virus. So we're actually pushing down the virus's army and making it so it can't grow. So we destroy coronavirus and we save people that we love around us. There are some people that have been concerned about the blood clots that were reported as part of as part of the Johnson and Johnson vaccines and the AstraZeneca vaccines. And this is just to put it into context and just to remember that the coronavirus infections themselves cause 16.5 of people to get blood clots, whereas an airplane travel even causes 3 to 5% of people to have blood clots. And the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines have been closer to between 1 and 4 cases in a million vaccines. So it's 300 times more likely that you would be hit by lightning than that you would get a blood clot from either of these vaccines. And those blood clots are not associated with mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines at all, in over 300 million shots in the United States alone. So that was just one of the questions I'd received earlier. Another question that I've heard is, can the COVID-19 vaccine affect my fertility? So when I heard this rumor, there's a video that was circulating on the internet that was quite convincing. And so I needed to convince myself that this was the case too, that it, whether or not it affected fertility. So what convinced me that it didn't affect fertility is that women became pregnant during the clinical trials. There were over 50 women that became pregnant during the clinical trials, even though they signed documents that said that they were trying to not become pregnant. Pregnancy was an exclusion factor. You weren't supposed to be pregnant while signing up for the clinical trials. So healthy babies from those pregnancies have now been born, and they have antibodies protecting the baby against COVID-19. So the vaccine is also, the other thing that convinced me that the vaccine doesn't affect fertility is that it's a warning sign of what the coronavirus looks like. And the coronavirus itself has not impacted fertility. So if people that had a coronavirus infection with the whole virus haven't had their fertility affected, then I don't think, then just a button on the coat of that virus shouldn't impact fertility either. And then now, in the last couple of months, I think 2 months ago, there was a paper published that showed that over 35,000 pregnant women who were vaccinated with the mRNA vaccines were studied, and they had no more adverse effects than the same number of people had in a 2019 study. So that shows that the vaccines are not causing any kind of miscarriage or anything like that. And then the placentas of vaccinated women that already gave birth were studied, and those placentas were all healthy. So that helped convince me that the COVID-19 vaccines do not affect fertility. These are my sources, but I'm happy to take questions now.
A question that I've heard a lot, or a concern I've heard a lot, is how do we know if the vaccine will have side effects long term, like down the road?
That's a great question. The way that I think about it is by looking at the other vaccines and knowing how the vaccines work, all vaccines work. So they all cause their peak number of antibodies in the 2 months following the injection. And so, and for polio, for MMR, for any of the vaccines that have been developed previously, the side effects that occur all happen in the first 2 months. Any adverse effect happens in the first 2 months. At this point, we're about a year after many people have gotten the vaccine, like the people in the clinical trials, and nothing has shown up. And then a lot of us have had the vaccine. I've had the vaccine for more than 2 months now. And so anything would have shown up by now if it was going to, because it would happen in the first 2 months.
What about talking to a friend or loved one who has is hesitant about the vaccine, who maybe is hesitant about the science, is hesitant about trusting these authorities? How would you suggest talking to them about it?
Yeah, that's actually a really common thing, right? We trust most the people that we know love us, and so the main thing to communicate in any of these conversations is love and compassion, um, because everyone wants to do what's best for themselves, right? They want to protect their safety and their health, and um, the fact that someone's willing to talk to us about the vulnerability means that they trust us, and so we need to honor that trust. So my suggestion is to always start from a position of trying to understand, trying to help the person understand that we're on their team. So it's us, humanity, all humans against the virus. I'm on your team, you're on my team, and let's find out what information you would like to help you feel comfortable, and can I help you find that information? You know, so instead of kind of just, I think in the science community we often just throw data at each other, and that's how we convince each other of something, but that's not so effective in a family relationship or a friendship, uh, because it sounds a little adversarial, right? It's like, I know this and you don't know that. But instead, if we can say, hey, I love you, I care about you, and I want all of us to be safe. What would help you feel comfortable um, with these vaccines? What information do you want? And I'll do anything to help you find it. Um, and then we're working together, right? And it may still mean, we all have autonomy over ourselves, so we each get to make decisions for ourselves, and that decision may be different than my decision, but we can still hold boundaries, right? In my case, I've got 2 little kids, and I don't really want them to be exposed to the virus, right? So if someone isn't vaccinated, I need the adults in the room, everyone who can, to be vaccinated or masked. And I don't care which one of those they take, but I'm not gonna like let my kid get really close to someone who uh, doesn't have any kind of protection. So I still hold those boundaries, but I do let people know, like, yeah, sure, spend time with my kids, let's spend it outside, wear a mask. And whenever you have questions, I'm super happy to try and find anything that I can to help you. That's how I approach it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We have some questions in the chat. A participant says, I'm an essential worker and I'd like to get vaccinated. My husband doesn't want to get vaccinated, and we have a 6-year-old that is not vaccinated. If I get vaccinated, could I be a threat to them by bringing the virus?
Oh yeah, that so absolutely not. You will not be a threat to them because you don't get the whole virus. So unlike the polio vaccine, which also can't give anyone else polio, but these are even less, they're less like the virus, right? It's only a button on the coat. So it cannot, and it's not even the button itself, it's just the message for how to make the button, and it disappears from your system within a couple hours. So it's just like a Snapchat message to your body saying, hey, this is the enemy, now I'm gone. And it's only your immune, it's your immune system that has a memory of what it looks like that's remaining in your body. So there's no threat to unvaccinated people if we get vaccinated. And in fact, by getting vaccinated, you protect both your 6-year-old and your husband by making it so you can't get infected. So now they have less of a chance to get the virus around them. Does that answer the question?
I think so, but if it didn't answer your question, feel free to put a follow-up in the chat. And we have another one. If I get vaccinated now, am I going to need another dose every year, just like what happens with the flu?
So a lot of that depends on how many people get vaccinated. So So if we get vaccinated, it's less likely that we'll need another shot. Um, so far, I know a lot of people that participated in the clinical trials, and their antibody levels are still really high, and it's almost been a year since they got their shot. So it seems like these are better than any vaccines that have ever been made, and so they'll probably last for longer. But like I said, the variants that arise in unvaccinated people. And so far, the vaccines have been effective against every variant that's around, but new variants will arise. And it could be that one, you can imagine that that army hat that we were using, if you painted a stripe on it, maybe your immune system recognizes it, maybe it doesn't. But you're more likely to recognize it if you've been warned than if you haven't been warned. So it's the same kind of idea with these variants. The variant may change something a little bit, like tweak it a little bit, but your immune system is going to be be able to protect you better if it's had a warning than if it hasn't had a warning. So we don't know if we'll ever need a booster. At this point, we don't need a booster, and we don't foresee needing a booster within the next year, but that will depend on the new variants that arise.
Thank you. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And this is recorded and will be on YouTube. And I will send it out to all registrants so you can come back to it again if there's a concept or an idea you'd like to revisit.
Awesome. And I have many other sources as well that I can send to you.
That would be great. Yeah, I will share those with everyone who's registered. Thank you so much, Dr. Bates. I really appreciate having you today.
Thank you for all of you participating. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thanks.